Hi, I'm Dan Hungerman in the economics department at the University of Notre Dame, and I am delighted to be giving a talk titled Opiates of the Masses, Deaths of Despair, and the Decline in American Religion. This talk is based on work with two other co-authors. The first is Tyler Giles. He is a talented graduate student here in the economics department at Notre Dame, and the other is Tamar Ostrom. She is a professor at The Ohio State University. I want to say thank you for giving me a chance to present this work, and I hope you find it interesting. So to begin with, let me pull up some slides here and use them to tell you a little bit about deaths of despair, what that term means, and why it's interesting. So the term deaths of despair comes from the work of these two scholars. This is Ann Case and Angus Deaton. They're professors at Princeton University. Both are extraordinarily accomplished scholars. A couple years ago, Angus Deaton won the Nobel Prize for his work in economics. So a few years ago, these two scholars published a really important paper looking at mortality for middle-aged Americans, and they found something extraordinary in that work. What they found, really, you can gather from the title. It's a long title, but it packs a lot in there and really says everything. Rising morbidity and mortality in midlife among white, non-Hispanic Americans in the 21st century. And that's what they found. They found when they looked at mortality, the rate at which middle-aged Americans were dying, that near the start of the 21st century, mortality rates began to go up. That's very unusual among advanced countries. Normally, when you think about the rates at which people of a certain age are dying, as time goes on and countries become more economically developed and healthcare improves, people for a given age are going to be less likely to die than people of the same age would have been a generation before. But that's not the case in the United States today. You can see that from this figure. This is taken from their paper. It shows for middle-aged whites in the United States who are non-Hispanic, the overall death rate per 100,000. The picture starts in 1990 and goes through 2010. You can see the red line is the one for the United States, and all the other lines are for other countries. The United States line is going up, but for all the other countries, it's going down. This is a very unusual trend, and when it was first documented by Case and Deaton, no one was really sure what was going on. Case and Deaton themselves go further, and they note that there are several particular causes of death which seem to be driving this increase in mortality. In particular, suicides, poisonings, and when you hear poisonings, that very often means drug overdoses. And then finally, deaths from cirrhosis or other similarly related liver diseases seem to be driving this increase. Cirrhosis in particular is a disease that often comes from very heavy drinking over a number of years. It can be driven by alcoholism. All three of these causes of death kill a lot of Americans every year. And it turns out that for middle-aged white Americans, these causes of death have been increasing so much that the overall mortality rate for these Americans has been going up over time. That is, the increases in deaths of despair, as these three causes are known, has swamped any gains that we might have seen from falls in deaths from heart disease or cancer or anything like that being better treated by the medical establishment. Why are these causes of death increasing so much for this group of Americans? That's a question that a lot of scholars have asked. And it's a question they're going to continue to ask, by the way, as a lot of preliminary evidence suggests that in the past year, during the pandemic, deaths of despair increased even more. Well, there are a lot of potential causes for these sorts of deaths. One thing you might think of would be economic inequality. So in the past quarter century in the United States, we've seen increases in economic inequality. And so as we've had greater divides between the haves and have-nots, perhaps that's driving deaths of despair. Another very important potential explanation would be opioid availability. So in the 1990s, a very powerful and it turned out dangerous type of opioid, OxyContin, was introduced and aggressively marketed. It is safe when used in some circumstances, potentially, but it is also open to abuse, and it has killed many Americans. While these are natural potential explanations, work has struggled to quantify their importance. And in fact, many scholars, among them Case and Deaton, have considered the possibility that there might be other potential explanations, in particular, explanations related to culture. And that's what we're going to try to focus on in this project here. To begin that focus, we're going to start with two facts. The first fact is that the rise in deaths of despair from middle-aged Americans actually begins earlier than most studies recognize. It starts around 1990. Most other work looks later, maybe for two reasons. The first is that all-cause mortality, which is what was in the picture I showed you earlier, only begins to clearly rise around the year 2000. The second is that death certificates in the United States, for coding reasons, kind of changed in 1999, and so it's a little difficult for a researcher to go back before then. So most studies that have followed up on Case and Deaton's work start in the year 1999. We go back earlier, and we focus on these deaths of despair, and by doing so, we observe that there are increases in these causes of death that happened before most scholars were aware. Notably, this increase that we see around 1990 happens before the introduction of OxyContin, so it cannot be explained by OxyContin. My point in raising that observation is not to insist that OxyContin was unimportant. I think it was an important player in the overall story here, but simply to say that there must be more to the story than just that. Next, we're going to note that this increase in deaths of despair in the early 1990s happened just after one other important large-scale social change, the decline in religious attendance in the United States. With those two facts, we're going to begin a study trying to relate religious participation with adult mortality. To conduct this study, we're going to try to do two things. And these are the two things that I'm going to try to show you today in this talk. Step one is to try and see whether the decline in religious affiliation that's observed in the late 80s and early 90s in the data is driven by the same group of individuals that subsequently saw increases in rates of deaths of despair. That will be the first part of this talk today. And then secondly, we're going to look at another important shock to religious participation that happened in the United States in the second half of the 20th century, related to a government policy, blue laws. And we're going to try to exploit changes in blue laws to learn about religious participation and adult mortality, and in particular, mortality from deaths of despair. So I'll tell you a little bit more about blue laws and about all of that later on. But first, we're going to begin with a descriptive analysis where we look at changes in mortality for middle-aged whites. We're going to show you that those changes happened in the early 1990s, and then we're going to try to relate that to changes over time in religious participation. So let me start by showing you a picture similar to the one that I showed you earlier that's taken from Case and Deaton's work. However, this picture is going to focus on a period before 1999. So we're going to go back actually even before 1990, before the picture that Case and Deaton's considered. And then secondly, this picture is just going to focus on deaths from poisoning, suicides, and liver disease. Here's the trend that you see when you do that, looking for whites in the United States, ages 45 to 54. The mortality rates that we see here are clearly declining in the 1980s, but then you'll note that they kind of flatten out and begin to rise. In fact, if you fit a trend line over the first decade in this picture, that line fits really well to begin with. And if you go back earlier into like the 1970s, I mean, you'll still see kind of a steady decline happening then. So things aren't too exciting, even if we were to add extra early years in this picture. But right around 1990, we kind of break from trend. The decline that we see in mortality plateaus, and then it slowly begins to rise. Now, certainly the second half of this picture, the right half of this picture, is pretty interesting. I'm not surprised that so many scholars have paid attention to it. But we think that the middle part of this picture, which has received absolutely no attention, is also pretty interesting. If you go to the mid 1990s, like 1995, the mortality rate here is 33% higher than would be suggested by the trend line. So we're way above where we might expect to be based on historical patterns in the data. And remember, that's before the introduction of OxyContin. So the first thing that we're going to do in this paper is ask ourselves the question, was there anything that was happening, say, in the mid 80s or late 80s, or maybe the early 90s, right around when we first see a break from trend here, that might possibly explain some of this increase in the mortality rates? Well, as I told you, what we're going to do there is look at religious participation. We think that religious participation is a good phenomenon to focus on for a few reasons. The first is that the decline in religious participation that happened in the 1980s and early 90s began at a similar time, maybe slightly before the increase in mortality rates. So the timing potentially matches up kind of well. Second, religiosity is well known to matter a lot for health and well-being. There's a lot of work that has been done on that topic, including work by professors at Indiana University East, like Feller-Bose, that have explored a relationship between religiosity and health outcomes. Another thing is, of course, that religiosity is a very widespread activity in the United States. And as I will show you in a minute, the decline in religiosity observed over this period is also very large and widespread. So it potentially could help explain the large increase in mortality that we're seeing. But something that we don't know is whether the decline in religiosity is coming from the same people as is the increase in mortality. So to consider that possibility, we're going to take data from the General Social Survey. This is a roughly biennial survey. Biennial means it happens roughly every other year. It's a nationally representative survey for people all over the country. Each year it includes about 1,500 respondents, and that's going to be big enough for us. And it asks about religious affiliation and attendance. To begin with, I'm going to take a question in the survey about how often people attend worship services. Answers are scored on an index created by the GSS that goes from 0 to 7, where 0 is never attending and 7 is more than every week. Each 1 unit increase on this index is roughly a doubling of how often a person attends. So this scale is roughly somewhat similar to a log scale. The mean of this scale is about 4. That corresponds to about monthly attendance. So this is an index that we construct to measure attendance, but I'll show you a couple other measures of religiosity that are a little more easy to interpret in just a minute. So here's a picture of attendance as measured by this index. Again, it starts around 4, and that corresponds to roughly monthly attendance over time in the General Social Survey. What you can see is that attendance kind of holds steady during the 1970s and most of the 1980s, and then it kind of begins a decline starting in the late 1980s. The index falls in value from about 4 to about 3.5. That's a reasonably large decline. I'll discuss the magnitudes of declines in religiosity in a few more minutes. Now what I'm going to do is start to hone in and focus on the same group of individuals that see the increase in deaths of despair, middle-aged whites. Here I limit the sample just to white respondents in the General Social Survey. We're only going to focus on whites. We can't differentiate between Hispanics and non-Hispanics, by the way, at this point in the study, because information on Hispanic ethnicity is not coded on death certificates going back this far. When I focus the sample just on whites, what we can see is that religious attendance is a little bit lower most years, but that the overall trend is not too different. Next, I focus just on whites who don't have a college degree. Now we see perhaps a slightly larger decline for this group. And finally, I'm just going to focus on middle-aged whites who don't have a college degree. I'm going to focus on individuals who don't have a college degree because work subsequent to Case and Deaton's initial publication has shown that the rises in deaths of despair for middle-aged whites has been especially strong for those who do not have a college degree. What we see is that for this group also, there is an unusually large decline in religious participation. Middle-aged whites who do not have a college degree actually report higher levels of religious attendance during the 1970s and most of the 80s in this sample. But by the end, they're no different or perhaps even lower than what we see for the average respondent. Here's a different measure of this change in religiosity. This comes by looking at the fraction of respondents who report weekly religious attendance. You can see that by looking at the y-axis, the values here are often around 0.2 or maybe up to 0.3. This suggests that about a quarter of Americans, about 25% or 0.25 of Americans, more or less, report weekly religious attendance. However, there's two lines in the picture. The black line is for middle-aged whites who do not have a college degree, and then the green line is everybody else. This picture tells a similar story. Once again, what we see is that middle-aged whites report higher levels of weekly religious attendance early on, and by the end, no different. One of the interesting things about the increase in deaths of despair is that the initial trends identified by Case and Deaton were observed primarily for whites as opposed to other races. What we'll see in this picture is that the decline in religious attendance appears to also be driven by whites. We don't really see much of a similar decline for non-whites. This is a picture of weekly attendance looking where the black line is whites, the green line is non-whites. In this particular picture, we smooth the data between different years of the study, taking averages across years. It's a running average across samples, because the sample of non-whites in the GSS can be kind of small. But that sort of smoothing doesn't really seem to matter for the main takeaway for the picture, which is that the decline in religiosity that we observe here seems to, again, be driven by whites. They report higher levels of weekly attendance compared to non-whites in the early years of this picture, and then by the end, they're reporting lower rates of weekly attendance. Another interesting result in the deaths of despair literature is that you see deaths of despair increasing for both men and for women. This then raises the question, do we see declines in religiosity both for men and for women? And the answer to that question is yes. Here's a picture where we break information in the general social survey out by the gender of the respondent. The green line is females. That line is higher up because they report higher rates of weekly religious attendance. That's the measure of religiosity here again. The black line is for males. Because we have these two lines and we've kind of expanded the y-axis a little bit, the lines look a little bit flatter. It's kind of a mechanical effect of expanding the y-axis some. But if you look, you'll observe that both of these groups, men and women, report higher levels of religious attendance in the 1980s, and by the end of the sample in the 90s, they're both reporting lower levels of religious attendance. So the decline that we see here is driven by both genders, just as the increase in deaths of despair is driven by both genders. We can also break our results by rural or urban status. Some coverage of the phenomena of deaths of despair might give the impression that the increase in deaths of despair is a primarily rural phenomenon, but actually it's not. The increase in deaths of despair is a phenomenon that's observed in all different sorts of settings in the United States. The same is true for the decline in religiosity. Here we compare not rural individuals, that's the black line, to rural individuals in the general social survey. Now, this is a little bit of a noisier picture, but it also seems from the picture that the decline in religiosity that we're observing in the general social survey is not being driven by either one of these groups in particular. Both groups, again, observe reasonably high values, their highest values in the 1980s, or for the rural one, it kind of peaks at 1990 before a very large drop. And then during the 1990s, they both seem to drop, although the rural one is admittedly a little bit noisier. You can see, by the way, the magnitude of the declines, it's pretty big. The high point for, say, the not rural group is close to 25%, and then it bottoms out at around 17%. That's about a 1/3 decline in the fraction of people who are reporting weekly attendance in the United States. The highest to lowest points for the rural one, again, are actually even bigger, but that is a somewhat noisier picture. Do we see similar trends for other age groups? Yes, we see increases for other age groups during this time period, but really 45 to 54-year-olds are the largest. So here is plotting by age over years in the general social survey, the fraction of individuals who report no religious affiliation. So in this picture, we're breaking things out by age, and we're also using a different measure of religious participation, which is the fraction who report that they have no religious tradition that they affiliate with. What you can see is that the red line, that's the line for people who are ages 45 to 54, increases sooner and more than the other lines. But the other lines for slightly older age groups do begin to catch up after we get out of the 1990s. Once again, the magnitude of the increases is also fairly noteworthy. In the 1970s and early 80s, the fraction of respondents of these ages who report no religious affiliation is only around 3 or 4%. By the end of the sample, we're headed up over 15%, even towards 20%. We could also think about this geographically, comparing places that see larger or smaller changes in religious participation over time. That's what we do in this picture. Here we compare from the late 1980s to the year 2000 changes in religious attendance for each state that we have a large enough sample to use in the GSS. That's the y-axis in this picture. And then on the x-axis, we have changes in the death rate from the late 80s to around 2000. So we plot each state. There are a few things to notice. The first is that in this picture, most of the dots are below the origin, below the horizontal line here. That means that over this period, over roughly the last decade of the 20th century, most states saw a decline in religiosity. The next thing is that many states also are on the right side of the picture. In fact, the most crowded quadrant is this one. These are states that saw a decline in religious attendance and an increase in deaths of despair for middle-aged whites. Looking over the picture entirely, it looks like a negative pattern. What does that mean? That means that places which saw a relatively large decrease in religious attendance, those would be places that move down on the picture, are places that have relatively high increases in deaths of despair, places that would be on the right edge of the picture. So step one here was to try to look at basic patterns across time and across place to see if there was any relationship between the decline in religiosity observed in the United States in the late 1980s and early 1990s and the subsequent increase in deaths of despair for middle-aged Americans. What we can see is that it does seem like the same group was driving both of these trends. Middle-aged whites see larger declines in religiosity. They are also the ones who are driving increases in deaths of despair. We also looked at a few null results that suggest similar or null effects for religiosity, just as there are similar or null effects for deaths of despair. For example, we see similar results here for both men and women when we look at both religiosity and deaths. We see results being driven by whites, but not by non-whites in both cases. And it's worth noting that this decline in religiosity was specific to the United States. One of the biggest challenges for people coming up with explanations for deaths of despair has been trying to find something that matters in the United States, but doesn't matter in many other countries, because many other countries did not see an increase in deaths of despair of the same magnitude, or even any increase at all over the period that Case and Deaton consider. You may recall, we saw that all those other countries in that early picture of Case and Deaton that I showed you at the start of this talk show countries with mortality rates going down. Those are also countries that saw no large shock in religious participation at the same time that the United States did. So that's a good first step, but it still leaves a few unanswered questions on the table. For example, maybe both of these shocks were being driven by something else. And while it's well known that religiosity might matter for health, we don't know of much work that relates religiosity to mortality for middle-aged Americans, specifically concerning these sorts of outcomes, deaths of despair. So to try to address those issues, in the second part of our project, we look at blue laws. What are blue laws? Blue laws are laws that restrict certain activities on the Sabbath, typically on Sundays. Nowadays in the United States, there's a lot of stuff that you can do on Sundays if you want, at least when there's not a pandemic keeping things closed. For example, you can go to the mall, you can go to Walmart, you can buy groceries. There was a time when blue laws restricted many of those sorts of activities. Today, people primarily think of blue laws as being related to the sale of alcohol. So, for example, here in the state of Indiana, there are laws that regulate the sale of alcohol on Sundays. Up until a couple of years ago, it was very hard to walk into a store and buy any alcohol at all in the state of Indiana. But blue laws traditionally have been much broader in their list of prohibited activities. And in the conversation I'm going to share with you today, we should think of blue laws as being broader, stronger blue laws, laws that regulate all sorts of general notions of commerce, not just alcohol sales or automobile sales or anything like that. Why are they called blue laws? Truth is, nobody knows. There's a bunch of explanations. I'm not sure I find any of them particularly compelling. But blue laws are old. They've been around for a long time. All of the original colonies in the United States had blue laws, some of them very, very strict. And in the middle of the 20th century, most states had a very general sort of blue law, the sort that we're going to talk about today. But those sorts of laws are not very common now. Why is that? Well, it all began in 1961. There was a U.S. Supreme Court case, McGowan versus Maryland, on the constitutionality of blue laws. This case upheld the constitutionality of these laws, but laid out a test by which blue laws could be found unconstitutional. In particular, these laws could be thrown out if their list of what was prohibited rested on grounds irrelevant to the achievement of a state's objectives. That rule was the beginning of the end for a lot of blue laws. That's because a lot of blue laws had famously silly or complicated lists of activities that could be prohibited, often with all sorts of loopholes. Because these laws had these silly, complicated lists, they could be challenged in court as being irrelevant to the achievement of a state's objectives. For example, in Arkansas, you could sell film but not flash bulbs on Sundays, or film and flash bulbs but no cameras. In New Jersey, you could buy disposable diapers but not washable diapers, and in Texas, you could buy hammers but not nails. Because of these silly restrictions and the challenges that were happening in courts after the Supreme Court case, a lot of these laws got tossed. Our idea then is to see what happens when a law gets repealed and the mall can open on Sundays. This is going to be a change in what economists call the opportunity cost of attending religious services on Sunday. Now, a bunch of prior work has looked at how blue laws impact religious attendance, and what they have generally found is that when the mall opens on Sunday and a blue law is repealed, religious attendance declines, and it falls by a reasonably large amount, something like 5%. What we're going to ask in this paper is whether mortality changes as well. I'm going to do this by showing you a couple basic pictures, and I'm also going to consider a more sophisticated regression analysis approach. I'll describe some of the details of that, but I'm not going to get into a ton of the gory details. Before I do any of that, however, let me tell you a little bit more about these laws. First, we're going to focus on states that had broad statewide laws prohibiting commerce on the Sabbath. Many states, instead of having statewide laws, left it up to counties to decide. In that case, since we don't have county level data for religiosity to establish the first step of this story, blue laws affecting religiosity, we're going to focus just on the state level laws that we can. That's going to leave us with this collection of states here on this map. The lightest shaded states are ones which changed their laws in the 50s or 60s, mostly the 60s. The gray ones are states that changed their laws in the 70s, and the black ones are ones that changed their laws in the 80s or early 90s, almost all in the 80s. That's going to comprise our sample. We have some variation with different parts of the country represented. Looking at that map might make you wonder what's going on in a state when blue laws are repealed. And so in our project, we spend a bunch of time talking about that. Let me spend a little bit of time talking about it right now. First, the circumstances under which a blue law was repealed often varied. So sometimes it happened after lengthy court battles. Maybe the ruling of a certain court was appealed many times, and it might have dragged on for several years. Sometimes the legislature got involved, either in response to a court ruling or preempting a court ruling that it appeared was going to be coming out in the near future. Occasionally, a legislature might take action without a court prompting. And in some cases, there were individuals who played really important roles either in keeping these laws on the books for a long time or getting them repealed really quickly. Within a state, individuals often disagreed about whether or not these laws were going to be helpful for the economy or for any other social effect. There has been some research trying to explore whether or not certain sorts of states with certain sorts of economies or with certain sorts of voters, were particularly likely to repeal blue laws. And that work has generally found that there is no systematic observable pattern between states that repealed these laws and states that didn't. At the bottom of this slide, I put a bunch of studies that have considered blue laws and used them in the nature we're going to use them in this project here. And some of these papers give other details. Here are a couple other important issues that are worth a quick mention about blue laws, however. First, you might wonder whether these laws were actually enforced. Now, if the laws were not enforced, that's going to bias us towards not finding anything when we go to see whether their repeal mattered. If a law was never enforced, then when you repeal it, nobody may care at all, nothing happens, and so we won't find anything. However, in a lot of cases when these laws were repealed, it was pretty newsworthy, and looking through newspaper archives and things like that, we've been able to find a lot of documentation and conversation in states when these laws were repealed. So we think it's pretty believable that they had an impact on religious participation and potentially then the health and well-being of adults. Another concern you have, and this is a big one, is that this may be a story of reverse causation. It might be that states were seeing a decline in religiosity, or more generally, what you might just call social capital, the strength of communities. And as states saw declines in religiosity or social capital, they subsequently not only got rid of their blue laws, but then also continued to see declines in religion. But this is a story where the blue laws didn't cause religiosity to fall. It's the other way around. Religiosity fell, and so blue laws were repealed. A bunch of work has considered this possibility, and most work has found that blue laws did create a discrete change in the incentives to attend religion that led to an immediate fall that is not explained by prior trends in religiosity. So the sort of sudden change in incentives that blue laws create, it looks like it can lead to an effective way to study the impact of a change in incentives to attend religion that's not polluted by reverse causation. And I'll show you a little bit of work on that in this paper also. On this slide, I'm going to talk about the regression specifications that we use, and then I'm going to focus more on pictures. But if you're interested in the regression specification, here are the details. We're going to focus on deaths of despair from those three general causes that I mentioned earlier. We're going to adjust our death rates by age when we combine the results for all age groups together of middle-aged Americans, which are the results I'm going to focus on today. We're going to include a set of controls for economic conditions and some other basic observable characteristics of states and years over time. In our regressions, we're going to include a set of state and year dummies, and also in some specifications, we include trends to look at trends over time, linear trends, quadratic trends, for example. The unit of observation is going to be a certain age group in a certain state in a certain year. So all individuals ages 45 to 54 in Texas in 1974. That would be an example of the unit of observation here. We're going to weight by cell size. So we're going to pay more attention to what's going on in Texas than we are what's going on in Vermont. Looking at the death rate in a certain state and year from deaths of despair, we're going to regress that death rate on a measure such as a dummy variable for whether or not blue laws have been repealed in that state. In some of the results, we use a year-by-year interacted approach, an event study approach, in other words, instead of just a simple dummy variable here. We'll include all of these controls, and we'll be especially interested in testing the hypothesis that this coefficient delta is 0. That is, that the repeal of blue laws has no impact on deaths of despair. To begin with, let me show you a simple picture using trends in the data. The year 1985 was an eventful one when it came to the repeal of blue laws. 3 states Texas, South Carolina, and Minnesota repealed their blue laws that year. So to begin with, let's just trace out over time the rate of deaths of despair for middle-aged whites in those states, that's the solid line, versus other states in our sample. That's the dashed line. You can see I've put this vertical line denoting the point in which the law was repealed for our treatment states here. The treatment states being the ones that saw a change in blue laws, a change in the incentive to attend religious services on Sunday mornings. The two lines look fairly parallel to begin with. Both see steadily, gradually declining trends in mortality, kind of similar to the linear trends in mortality going down that we saw in the picture earlier, where we noted a break from trend in the 90s. However, after blue laws are repealed, the two lines begin to move closer together. They immediately jump closer together by about 1 death per 100,000. So kind of a small jump up immediately, and then they kind of gradually begin to close in the years after that. So this simple visual inspection of the data suggests that perhaps after blue laws were passed, or repealed, there might have been something of a convergence in the mortality trends of states that saw that repeal versus other states. Of course, this is just for a couple of the states that repealed blue laws, and this is just for one particular year. By running regressions, we can potentially compare what happened in all of the states that saw repeals, and do so despite the fact that those repeals were occurring at all different points in time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Here are a couple pictures of regression results that harness the power of all the states that repealed their blue laws at the same time. First, I'm showing you a picture that again focuses on mortality for ages 45 to 55 in the United States. Here I'm plotting out year by year the estimated comparison of treatment states, those states that are about to repeal their laws, to other states. The x-axis here starts at -6. That means 6 years before repeal occurs. -5 means 5 years before repeal occurs, and so on and so forth until we get to 1. That's 1 year after repeal occurs. And then in this picture, what I've done is plot things out up until 8 years after repeal occurs. The year -1 is missing. That year is the omitted year in this study. Everything is normalized to that year. So we can interpret these coefficients as relative to that year. In other words, if a coefficient equals 0, that's like what this dot at -2 looks like. It's pretty close to 0. That means that the estimated death of despair rate for states that were about to repeal their laws looked about the same in this year, -2, as they did 1 year before repeal occurred. Stepping back then and looking at this picture overall, when we look before repeal, we see coefficients that are typically a little bit negative and no real particular pattern here at all. That means that states that were about to repeal blue laws actually saw, on average, if anything, slightly lower mortality rates than we see in other states. But after the repeal occurs, the mall opens on Sunday, and these adults stop going to church as much, we suddenly see a different, more consistent positive pattern where death rates, looking at deaths of despair for these groups, are actually consistently higher. The dashed line represents confidence intervals. A number of these particular year estimates are borderline statistically significant. If you do a joint test of the hypothesis that collectively all of these coefficients are 0, you can reject that hypothesis. So we see a positive pattern, an increase in deaths of despair for these groups that seems to begin after blue laws are repealed. Whether it increases over time or not, I don't know if I necessarily would say that. Here we look at a slightly older age group, ages 55 to 65, and we see a similar sort of story. There is no systematic increase or positive rate of deaths of despair for treatment states, those that were about to repeal their laws, in the years just before the repeal occurred. But then when we look after repeal occurred, we see this jump up. Things do wobble around. Coefficients are sometimes marginally significant, or maybe even in any individual particular year, not statistically significantly different from 0. But collectively, if we were to test a joint hypothesis that these are all zero, we would reject that hypothesis. So the data suggest a positive increase in deaths of despair for these individuals. And that increase, if you test this joint effect, is statistically different from zero. Let me describe a few other results. If you want to get into the details, these results are covered in more detail in our paper. First, we look at effects of deaths of despair for other age groups, and we do not really see consistent patterns. The results seem to be particularly driven by 45 to 55-year-olds or potentially 55 to 65-year-olds. We also do a few other tests that we discuss to some extent in the paper. We've looked at synthetic control tests where we try to find states that don't repeal laws that look a whole lot like the states that do, and we just use them for a comparison group. Those results usually look pretty good. We've tried dropping each state from the sample to see if, Texas, that's a really big state, is driving our estimates. That's not really the case. We then also try to quantify the overall size of the effect that we're estimating in this paper. So in the general social survey, we found that attendance fell by about 5 to 10% from repeal, the fraction of people reporting weekly attendance. From our Blue Laws estimates, we find that mortality rose by about 2 to 4 deaths per 100,000. That's similar both to that basic picture I showed you, focusing just on changes in 1985 for the 3 states that we looked at, as well as from the more sophisticated event study results that we do, and from our baseline regressions, which are in the paper, but I didn't report here. As you may recall, deaths of despair were already far above trend in 1995. If you look at the change in attendance that was created by Blue Laws and the subsequent change in mortality that we see after Blue Laws are repealed, and from that, you try to get an estimate of the relationship between mortality and religious participation. If you use that relationship and square it against the 5 to 10% effect of repeal that we see here in the GSS in the late 80s, it would suggest that declines in religion can explain 20 to 80% of that initial rise in deaths of despair that we see in the picture. In other words, our estimates suggest that the decline in religious attendance can explain an important fraction, 20 to 80%, of the break from trend that we observe by the mid-1990s when we look at deaths of despair. So the effects that we're talking about here, they're reasonably large in magnitude. What are the conclusions that we take away from this study? The first is that culture can matter for deaths of despair. We think that because we've seen large declines in religiosity that precede the increases in deaths of despair that have been noted by so many scholars. Using our Blue Laws results, we find that a large portion of mortality, of the rise in mortality in the early 90s, appears to be driven by a decline in religiosity. So there's a couple takeaways from that. The first is that if you're interested in thinking about why deaths of despair are on the rise, we think the early 1990s represent an overlooked period and that more scholars should ask what was going on in the early 1990s. A second thing is that this decline in religiosity, the one that we're focusing on as an important social change that happened during this time period, it's a kind of interesting change in that scholars have noted that it's a decline in religious participation in formal religious organizations and communities, but it's not so much driven by a decline in personal belief. To be sure, in the last 10 or 15 years, we have seen declines in personal belief in the United States. By personal belief, I mean things like the fraction of individuals who report believing in God or report that they pray all the time. But that's a relatively recent decline. This initial decline in the late 80s and early 90s, the one that happens right around the time of an increase in deaths of despair, it's a decline where you see very little change in personal belief. Why is that interesting? Because it suggests that there might be something about formal religious participation, not just personal belief, that matters for health outcomes. Finally, I want to reiterate that there are many contributors to this overall pattern that Case and Deaton first identified. Indeed, our focus on the early 1990s in this study makes this obvious. In the mid-1990s, OxyContin didn't even exist, but already we are far above trend when we look at deaths of despair for middle-aged white Americans. A couple other concluding remarks. First, a lot of work on the health benefits of religion focus on religiosity during periods of extreme social trauma. For example, how people respond during periods of warfare. Here, we're looking at changes in health outcomes that occurred during the 1990s, an era of peace and prosperity by and large for the United States. But during this period, we see large increases in deaths of despair, and we think this illustrates an important role for religiosity in affecting health outcomes, even absent large traumas like massive economic downturns or exposure to combat and things like that. A final point is that if there is an important connection between formal religious participation and subsequent health outcomes, it suggests a big challenge for policymakers who are trying to fully reverse these trends. Certainly some sorts of policies related to combating opioids could have large impacts on individual behavior, for better or for worse. And there's a lot of work in this literature that considers those sorts of policies. But policies pertaining to formal religious participation, those are much more difficult to come by here in the United States. So let me say thanks again for considering this research. I hope you found it interesting. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on email. But in the meantime, I hope you're doing well, and thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Dan, for joining us. From Notre Dame. I found your talk very interesting. I'm curious, we'll see if anybody in the audience has any questions, but before that, the one question I had is, what is it about participation that, reduces deaths of despair? I don't think I remember you talking about it, but what is it about getting together once a week or once a month, that might be a factor in reducing, why people might see less deaths, alcoholism or opioids or any of the other things that you brought up?
Yeah. Well, first, let me just say once again, thank you so much. Really, really happy to share this work with everyone, and appreciate everybody who spent some time checking out this research, and I hope you found it interesting. So to answer that question, I think that a really likely answer to that question actually ties into some work related to some of the work that you've done, actually, looking at the importance of religious organizations as what social scientists and economists might call clubs. Important work by Lawrence A. Annacone really got this started, which argues that religious organizations they impose important rules on their members and guidelines and ways of living for various reasons, and that groups that do that may really make a difference in how their members behave. So I think that might be part of it, and I think that more generally, there's just something about people being social with each other and interacting with each other. There's been a lot to think about the past year as some of that's been taken away from us, and I think that's a really important part of a lot of social activities, and it appears that religion's one of them.
Right, and then you see a lot of people with COVID, going on Zoom and so on, yeah. Zoom services and other ways of connecting. I mean, do you anticipate? I mean, being in Zoom is not as I don't know. Maybe it's not as effective as actually being in person. Do you have any guesses as what we might expect? Because of this this tumultuous year?
I guess we'll see. I can certainly say, like, as a professor, right? I mean, Zoom's kind of different. You know, like lots of schools, there's all sorts of education that happens at my school, in person, hybrid, different things. Personally, I really enjoy connecting with students in person. And, I think that Zoom's really great, and interacting over the internet, it can do a lot. But, emotionally, if nothing else, it's not always the same. So hopefully moving forward, people will be able to get back to in-person stuff more. Whether it makes a difference for religious organizations or these outcomes that we're talking about now, I would guess it does, but I couldn't say for sure just yet.
Okay. Now we do have one question from Stephanie, so let me just read it. I can't help but think that what, if any, impact Generation X ethos has on this increase? Was there something about generational shift that contributes to this increase?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Generation X, so I can appreciate that question. For the presentation that we just had, a lot of the action there for mortality is going to be people a little older than Generation X, but the bad news, maybe I guess you could say, is that since then there is some evidence that my generation has seen some increases in some of these causes of death, like opioids and things like that. There's also definitely evidence that my generation has also caught up with or contributed to an overall continued decline in formal religious participation. Yeah, so we're coming late to the show here in Generation X, but maybe playing a part.
Okay. And then you had one comment from one person. It's more of a comment, I think, saying that the opposite of addiction is connection. Whether you would agree with that? I'm guessing, based on what I've heard, that's something you would agree with.
It's a really thought-provoking comment. Really appreciate someone from the audience sharing that. Yeah, it's an interesting thought here at the end. Yeah.
Okay. And one more question. I mean, it's in other countries around the world. You're seeing maybe you're seeing more problems with addiction. Maybe some of these are not big problems yet. I know you said in Europe, the deaths have been going down, but you don't really see in Europe that attendance in churches and synagogues was not that high in the first place. So so we haven't seen that big a drop. But in other countries, like countries that have more Eastern religions like Buddhism, Hinduism, where there isn't where people don't regularly meet together, as like you see in Christianity or Islam. Is there? I don't know. I guess how would you think in terms of how can people, if connection is important? I mean, you need to, in a sense, you got to have connection somewhere outside of religion, right? I mean, it's not going to be, you're not going to meet at your temple every week, on Saturday or something, but it's, I don't know, maybe it's the family connections that are important at that point. Do you have any thoughts or any?
Yeah, certainly. It's not as well studied as is more Western religions, but yeah, there's certainly some really interesting work that looks at like Eastern religions and tries to see whether they have important pro-social values. Elaine Liu is a professor at the University of Houston who's done some interesting experiments on Confucianism, for example, randomly getting people to study Confucian texts, people who are from religious traditions where they would have familiarity with Confucianism. And, she's found that it does affect pro-social behavior for some individuals. So I think even there's potentially a story for how the institutions that religiosity creates could matter for what people do and how they make decisions. But whether Eastern religions could lead to same sort of story in other countries as what we're seeing here with religiosity and deaths of despair, I'm not sure. Because as you note, I mean, they are different in some important ways. Yeah.
Right. We had another question from the audience member, Sarah. She says, do you believe that virtual community growth has reached those who may not otherwise have access, or makes more acceptable or welcoming to the community? I guess if I were to, are we seeing different people attending church virtually now, as opposed to they would never sit inside a building, for example? And whether that might, I don't know, whether that's a counter argument for what I said earlier.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for the hard evidence on that. I've actually been asked that question quite a few times in the past year, and I'm not sure what's going to happen. I am definitely, I guess you could say, concerned for a lot of small churches and congregations that might be hit hard financially. A lot of small charities in general, small local charities in the United States. There's evidence that there's been a lot of giving to those sorts of charities more in the past year. So I think many people share my concern. Whether a shared concern for local churches or other charitable organizations counteracts the problems of the past year, I don't know yet, and whether Zoom will or not, I honestly truly have no idea. I'll be very interested to see. I hope we can all learn that soon.
Right.
Yeah.
Those are all the questions I had, and I don't see any more other questions. Thank you again for joining us on Zoom.
Yeah, sure. Right.
Yeah. Hopefully you
Yeah.
can have you on campus one of these days, since you're not too far from IU East. So
yeah, just down the road here. So until that happy day, let me just say again, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Hope everybody had a good time.